Hello everyone, my name is Guy Pigden. I am the Savage Filmmaker. I make feature films, web series and shorts, and I'm here to give tips and advice to indie filmmakers about how to make those things. Now, I know I've been away for a little while, but I've been using my off time to make some awesome video content that I know everyone's gonna love. Today, we're talking about today we are talking about you know, I don't even know what we're talking about. I'm just doing these videos about whatever piece of gear is relevant this week, stuck on this mindless, never-ending YouTube hamster wheel of content creation, and for what? For a few cents in advertising revenue? Thumbs up from an anonymous stranger on the internet? I mean, what are we doing here, guys? I used to be a filmmaker. I used to make movies. And now I'm arguing in the comments section about how many cores a computer needs. You know what? Screw you, YouTube. No more praying to the algorithm gods. No more niches. No more clickbaity thumbnails. No more content creation pissing contests. From now on, I'm doing this for me, okay? 2022 is about originality. It's about creativity and rejecting the YouTube status quo here once and for all. And I'm challenging you people to come on that journey with me.
Welcome, Savage Filmmaker, son of Charles.
You know me?
It is my curse to know all who journey here. Also, you dropped your wallet.
Okay. What is this place?
A type of creator purgatory where once promising YouTube channels go when they've not had regular updates.
And you are...
A lifetime ago, I too sought the life of a content creator. I even became monetized, but my popularity waned, and I was banished. Here, I have become a manifestation of the YouTube algorithm, guiding others to a treasure I cannot possess. I'm also a skull which is red, so naturally they call me Redtube.
I think that name might be taken.
What?
Never mind. So, how do I get out of here?
YouTube requires sacrifice. A soul for a soul.
A sub for a sub.
A like for a like. You must seek that which is in front of you. It is also that which you fear.
Comparison videos?
Comparison videos about Mac computers.
No! Wow. Let's get started. It's a question as old as time itself. Can a laptop computer really beat a desktop? Can the almost best Apple Intel Imac currently on the market be beaten by the almost best M1 Max? Can you sell your Intel Imac and get this powerful, portable M1 Macs without losing any performance? That's what I'm going to answer today from a video editor's point of view. But that's not all. We're also going to see how the M1 Max compares in terms of editing performance to the original M1. Just what does the new M1 Max chips with the extra cores and unified memory mean for you, the editor, when you pay the extra $1,500 for this version? First, for context, you may want to go back and check out my first comparison videos where I compared the original Mac M1 to my Intel Imac, testing Red RAW footage, Canon C200 RAW Lite, and Blackmagic B-RAW timelines in Adobe Premiere, Davinci Resolve, and Final Cut. This will give you a good idea of the baselines and type of testing involved. This time around, I'm doing all of those tests again, but I'm also introducing a series of new timelines using Red RAW 6K Komodo footage. So it's safe to say I'm pushing these machines. Most YouTube reviews don't account for real professional editing workflows. This includes the use of high-end RAW footage with high bit rates and a relatively detailed color grading process with multiple nodes and complex timelines that last longer than 5 or 10 minutes. So first, let's talk about the new timelines I'm testing. I'll be testing my 2021 year in review timeline, which features an opening skit shot on the Red Komodo in 6K in Red RAW LQ with a grade applied and extended use of the Dehancer plugin. It also has a mixture of additional 6K B-RAW and 4K Pro Res and H.264 footage, all in a whopping 48-minute timeline. I'm also looking at my M1 buyer's guide, which features an opening Red RAW Komodo sequence, the same mix of other video formats, and is also a pretty massive 31 minutes long. Then there is my review of the Dehancer plugin. This timeline is just under 24 minutes. It features an extended opening sequence shot on the Red Gemini in 5K at 8:1 and then graded using Dehancer. It also features Redcode 36 footage, Blackmagic 6K B-RAW footage, and H.264 compressed 4K video, all with a lot of grading applied. And finally, there is my Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro long-term review. This is 18 minutes long and features another opening short filmed on the Red Gemini at 5K 8:1 and the same mix of other codecs as the other three timelines. I am primarily testing these timelines on both computers in Davinci Resolve, as this is what they were edited and graded in originally. In terms of the specs of each system, my Intel Imac is the newest Intel Imac 2020 with the 10th gen Intel iCore i7 processor, the upgraded and best Radeon Pro 5700 XT graphics card with 16 gigs of memory and 64 gigs of RAM. I also upgraded the Ethernet connection. The only way to further upgrade this iMac would be for me to have purchased the 10-core i9 processor, but benchmarking suggests this would not really improve its performance due to the thermal throttling. My new M1 Max is the 16-inch 32-core version with 32 gigs of unified memory. Again, this is the almost best M1 Max you can currently buy, with the only further upgrade being 64 gigs of unified memory. Now, comparing the price of both of these machines with these particular upgrades, the iMac would cost you $4,100, while the M1 Max costs $3,500. Advantage M1, right? Well, that's only if you choose to let Apple themselves upgrade your RAM to 64 gig with the Intel Imac. If you choose to do this yourself and buy third-party RAM through Amazon, you'll end up saving around $400 to $500. And I will leave a link in the description to the RAM I purchased to make those savings. Which means the cost of each are now almost the same. With the iMac, you get extra USB 3 ports and a 27-inch screen. With the M1 Max, you get an extra Thunderbolt port and an extra HDMI port, but no USB 3 ports and no high-speed Ethernet connection. The iMac's 27-inch 5K liquid retina display is obviously bigger than the 16-inch MacBooks, but the 16-inch display is definitely better quality. And of course the M1 Max is portable, whereas you won't be lugging around your iMac to your local Starbucks as you pretend to work while actually people watching and sipping on your chai latte. So there's pros and cons to both computers, without a really definitive winner in terms of value and or hardware advantages. But let's get down to what really matters: editing performance. First, let's look at the playback of these timelines. So just so you can see the setup here, I have the M1 Max here and I'm recording the screen, I'm recording myself, and I'm recording here on 4K. So no screen recording today, because I want to make sure that all the tests are not compromised by that. Okay, so now we're looking at the M1 buyer's guide in Resolve. Currently, we have quite a heavy grade on this one. It does not have any of the dehancer plugin effects like the other two. So in theory, it should actually export out a little bit quicker because we're not dealing with a whole bunch of film grain and stuff like that. But we still do have some denoising going on and a little bit of post sharpening and, you know, a few different layers of our color grade here. So there's still a fair bit going on. And if we just see if we can play it back now, and I'll just double check the settings. Yes, we're at UHD. And if we try and play this, you can see 18 frames, 24 frames. It's saying it's 24 frames, but we're actually getting a lot of stuttering. It's not really playing smoothly. So this is red Komodo footage. It is struggling, but of course, if you're just wanting to play the footage, so if we take that effect off and just see if we can play it now, we can see we're actually getting very smooth playback, and this is just with a LUT on now, but essentially we've taken off all the effects, all the grade, everything, and we're just playing through, and now we're not having any issues whatsoever. So the M1 Max can play these, you know, this 6K red footage, and it can do it quite well as long as you're not applying these heavy color grades. If we put that back on and we go down to our 1080 timeline, let's see if we can play that. So again, nice smooth playback, and now this is with the full grade on. We've got some overlaying stuff here, and it's also playing really quite well now. So what we're now seeing is, yeah, I think the sort of the power of the M1 Max is we're now getting some really nice playback at least a 1080 timeline. It's struggling a little bit through some of this heavy effect stuff that I've got going on here. But then we get back into the normal footage and it's playing back like really quite smoothly. Now we have my iMac fired up and set up, and we're going to run some of those same new videos. This is 6K Komodo footage, and you can see here playback at the moment we're getting quite a bit of lag. Now this does have quite a heavy grade on it, so we've got denoise and stuff like that. We're seeing a little bit of stuttering. We're seeing just not amazing playback here. Let's change that now, and we're gonna bring that back down to the 1080 timeline, and gonna try this again. And now it looks like we're getting nice smooth playback. So the iMac can play back this heavy grade with quite a few effects on in the 1080 timeline, no problem. But we are getting a little bit, we've got some heavy effects here as well, so taking a little bit longer when we get to this stuff, but when it's just sort of regular footage, we can see no worries. This particular export is the whole skit, including the color grade, but it does not have the Dehancer plugin color grade. So it's missing one step, one extra node where I add all my Dehancer stuff. So if we have a look at the color grade here, we can see that it actually has a bunch of nodes going on here. So we've got 10 nodes, a little bit of sharpening, denoising, and of course the grade itself, a little shape, everything. So it's a pretty full-on color grade. And if we just have a look at this footage now, when we play it, we can see that it's struggling. We're getting about 15 frames playback, so it's not really able to play that entirely, but we are in a UHD 4K timeline. So if we actually change this now to 1080, which is most of the time what you'd be editing in, and play back now, you can see that we're actually getting super smooth playback on the M1 Max. So this is playing back like super clean with denoising applied, which is a big deal, and sharpening, and a bunch of nodes, and it's just playing back super smoothly. So this is probably the most impressive thing I found about the M1 Max, is its ability to sort of play back this in 1080, because there's a lot going on here. So the fact that we're not dropping frames in this version of the timeline is pretty awesome. So we're just going to see if we can play this back. We're getting 15 frames. We're definitely getting some drop frames here. This is in the 4K timeline. So what I'm going to do is we'll drop that down to 1080 timeline and see if we can get smooth playback in 1080. And yeah, it looks like we can. It's playing back pretty well, pretty smoothly. Yes, we are dropping a couple of frames, but it's not too bad, and that's pretty impressive for a little bit of noise reduction and a pretty intense grade. What we can see, generally speaking, is that there is very little difference in terms of timeline playback between the iMac and the M1 Max. Both machines can play back 6K red Komodo footage in a 4K UHD timeline. And even with a grade applied, which introduces light denoising, sharpening, and color correction, you can still play back your footage, but it will start to lag. When you switch to a 1920 by 1080 timeline, which is probably what most people edit in, you'll get quite good quality playback on both machines. But as soon as you introduce heavy effects work using a plugin like Dehancer, which uses very graphics intensive effects such as film grain, you will not get any kind of smooth playback on either machine. And what we can see is now we're in this Dehancer section. We're not getting smooth playback because we're adding all this film grain and bits and pieces, so it's not playing back very smoothly still. It's a little bit stuttery and jerky. This is not really a huge surprise, given that this is something that even the beefiest computers will struggle with. This type of effect just can't really be handled in real time regardless of what you set your playback resolution to. What is very encouraging to see is the power of the M1 Max, which has certainly dramatically elevated its ability to play back raw high-resolution footage. The fact that you can edit a timeline in 4K with red raw footage and even apply some grading to it and still get a smooth editing experience is extremely impressive for a laptop. And the fact that I couldn't really notice any difference in playback between the M1 Max and the iMac shows you just how good the M1 Max is. It should be noted that this is where the original M1 immediately came up short, as it was rarely able to play back this type of footage in 4K and often struggled in only a 1080 timeline as soon as grading was applied. But now using the M1 Max, if we're comparing the playback and editing experience, I would call this a tie. So yes, in terms of playback and timeline performance, this M1 Max is going toe-to-toe with my desktop and absolutely holding its own. But now we come to rendering, And here's where things start to get really interesting, because a lot of these results were incredibly mixed and flipped back and forth depending on what type of footage was being rendered and the actual type of effects that had been applied to that footage. Now, I'll be completely honest, even with the iMac souped up 5700 XT graphics card, I kind of expected the M1 Max to really come out in the lead here with its twin encoders and decoders to assist with rendering. But honestly, that wasn't really the case. And this is definitely a situation where YouTube hype may have exaggerated my own expectations. The first and longest video, my Christmas 2021 year in review, which is an almost 50-minute timeline, shows that the iMac 2020 finished just under 2 minutes faster than the M1 Max. What was interesting is that the Komodo footage in the Christmas short that opens the video took longer on the M1 Max to render, but the rest of the video took longer for the iMac to render. So in effect, the M1 Max caught back up by the end of the timeline. When I exported just the opening Christmas short by itself, you can see that the M1 Max was almost 2 minutes slower than the iMac. But when I exported that same short without using the Dehancer color grade process, although the iMac still finished faster, the difference was only 21 seconds. The second test, the Mac M1 Buyer's Guide, is a solid 30-minute timeline, which also started with a Komodo short and included multiple layers and green screen compositing. In this case, the M1 Max finished about 1 minute faster than the iMac. This was the only time the M1 Max beat the iMac in this round of tests. But when I exported the opening Komodo short just by itself, the iMac managed to render it approximately 1 minute faster than the M1 Max. So once again, the M1 Max was catching up, rendering the more compressed footage later in the timeline. The trend remains similar for my Dehancer review, which clocks in at 23 minutes. Now this video features a long 6-minute opening short which features very heavy grading using Dehancer. It also features red raw footage examples graded with Dehancer throughout its runtime. And as you can see, the iMac finished 4.5 minutes quicker than the M1 Max. And when I exported the opening short film by itself, the iMac was still about 3 minutes quicker than the M1 Max, finishing the export in 13 minutes and 46 seconds, while the M1 Max took 16 minutes and 57 seconds to render the 6.5 minute short. My final timeline test was my eulogy for the Pocket 6K video at 18 minutes, which featured 5K Gemini footage for the opening short, along with the same mixture of other codecs. In this video, my Intel still came out on top, but by only 10 seconds. This was one of the few timelines I did not use the Dehancer plugin as part of my grading process, and I think this led to a much closer result. Add heavy grades and film grain, and the Intel iMac pulls ahead. Use more basic grades with less effects, and the M1 Max keeps up. Now let's take a look at some of the other tests I ran in my previous video. Looking at some shorter red code raw timelines, the M1 Max is finishing a little slower than the iMac, even with only a basic LUT applied to the footage. The same is true when using Canon C200 RAW Lite, although there is only a few seconds in it. When we render the Canon's compressed footage, we can see the M1 Max's render timelines are slightly quicker, and the same is true of the Pro Res timeline, although again the difference between the two machines is marginal. However, looking at a series of timelines using exclusively Blackmagic B-RAW footage shot on the Pocket 6K Pro at 12:1, we see that the M1 Max is quicker in all of the timeline tests, which is very interesting. For Adobe Premiere users, who still may be the majority of you, I also decided to run some of these same tests in the latest version of Premiere, which they claim is now very well optimized for the M1s. With the exception of the Red Gemini timeline, Davinci Resolve rendered these timelines much quicker, sometimes embarrassingly so. This just reinforced my opinion that Premiere, for all their updates and claims, are still way behind the 8 ball when it comes to maximizing the performance of the M1 chips. And what about the original M1? How much better performance are you getting when you pay over $1,500 more to upgrade to an M1 Max? Well, in a few instances, the render times are similar, but in most timelines, you will see that the M1 Max finishes around twice as fast. When you look at the Braw 6K footage, the performance increase is even more dramatic. Edits that would usually break the original M1 are now eaten for breakfast by the M1 Max. So if you find that your original M1 has been choking on the footage you edit with, then yes, the M1 Max will most likely provide the boost you need. So what can we ultimately take from all these tests? First, the bad news. Basically what we can see is that despite the M1 Max having all those cores and unified memory and twin encoders and decoders and the revolutionary M1 Max chip, all these innovations when dealing with raw codecs are still not as effective as having a good old-fashioned dedicated powerful graphics card. It's just that simple. However, when dealing with compressed video codecs like the Canon's MP4 or XFAVC footage, or any type of native Pro Res footage, then the M1 Max encoders begin to shine through and it does outperform the Intel Imac, albeit maybe not by that much. Also, whatever optimizations have been made for the M1 Max by Davinci Resolve, it's clear that the Max absolutely loves Blackmagic B-RAW footage. So if you film in B-RAW, then you can be confident the M1 Max will outperform your iMac in many scenarios, unless you start introducing those heavy effects into the mix. So, is the new M1 Max better than the best Intel iMac? No. Is the new M1 Max good enough to completely replace your Intel iMac? Yes. The results are so close that while the iMac may have a slight advantage when rendering tough footage, most of the time you will barely notice a difference. If you want a workhorse edit station that you can travel with that delivers almost the same performance as a desktop, then absolutely get rid of that Intel iMac and buy the M1 Max. If you are looking at the M1 Max as a true upgrade to the Intel iMac and you are hoping for a legitimate performance jump, don't buy the M1 Max. Stick with your desktop. As my testing shows, these M1 chips can't beat a good dedicated graphics card in most situations just yet. I think it's very easy to suffer from gas when Apple release a batch of new M1s, and it's also easy to get sucked into the hype that using the M1 Max as your desktop will be a smart option. But do you really need to? I have now replaced my iMac 2020 with this M1 Max machine full-time, and I also sold my original M1 just after the M1 Max announcements. But when I sold my Intel iMac, I brought a new M1 Mini to use in my studio. So what have I really achieved through all this computer buying and selling and buying again? Essentially, I replaced my stationary editing desktop with a more portable editing desktop, which is slightly worse. And I ultimately replaced my M1 Original Pro with an M1 Mini, which is also slightly worse. Reflecting back at my gear lust, I should have probably just kept my original M1 for the studio and my Intel iMac for editing. I would essentially be in the exact same position that I am right now with two computers that can do my work just as well, if not just slightly better. So can you replace your iMac with an M1 Max? Yes. But should you? Honestly, I think the only reason would be if you really need a portable workstation and you'd like to have one computer that can do everything. Otherwise, the value proposition and the performance gains are just not really there to make this a worthwhile choice, even though that's exactly what I did. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing, as I'll shortly be coming back with my full in-depth review of the M1 Max. And if you'd like to support me, consider watching my latest feature film, Older, available now for free on Amazon Prime and Tubi TV. As always, I am the Savage Filmmaker, and I'll see you when I see you.